In our previous lecture, we started a discussion about the legends and the mythology that have grown up around the Old West, and we're talking about roughly 1860s to 1890s, and in some cases a couple of decades past that. Um, this time around, we're going to focus, as the title indicates, on quote unquote lawless places and the people who were hired to keep the peace and enforce the law in such places. Now, most of those wide open towns that needed a strong hand in a peace officer, or at least that was the perception, were boom towns. And boom towns are towns that grow up practically overnight and kind of outstrip the ability of the town fathers or the town elders, whoever those might be, to sort of keep things organized because it's initially a whole lot of chaos. Here are some of those towns. This is a nice map. I like this one because it has both the cattle drives, cattle trails, and the railroads, and it includes the cow towns and the mining towns. Two different types of Wild West towns that were boom towns. Sometimes towns like this were really booming for maybe a couple of years, and then things started to die down, perhaps because the mining that was being done was played out, or because other ores were discovered somewhere else, and that's where everybody went. Or sometimes, as in the case of Abilene, the railroad kept going westward, and a lot of the cattle drives shifted over to Dodge City. Anyhow, you can see the major cattle towns here, most of them in Kansas, Dodge City and Abilene and Ellsworth and Wichita. Ogallala, Nebraska, and Cheyenne, Wyoming would also count as cattle towns, and the major mining towns from Tombstone, Arizona Territory, to Deadwood in South Dakota, then Dakota Territory, Virginia City, Leadville, and so on. As we've discussed in some detail in recent lectures, those cattle drives, most of which started down in South Texas and headed up to the rail lines in Kansas, except the Goodnight Loving Trail, which headed to Wyoming by means of New Mexico and Colorado. Most of them, though, headed to headed to Kansas. Took 2 or 3 months usually for the cow hands to get those herds up to the cow towns, where they would then be sold, loaded onto railroad cars, and probably taken to Chicago to be slaughtered and processed. 2 to 3 months on the trail is in the summertime is a lot of work, and when the trail hands got to the cow town, at that point they were usually paid off. Some of them would stay on through the fall and winter, but a good many of them would not because they were no longer needed until the spring. Anyhow, they'd be paid off and they'd get 2 or 3 months' pay all at once in one of these wide open towns where there's lots of things to spend your money on. And of course, that includes a lot of alcoholic beverages, which cowboys would frequently make use of. And then you would see this type of thing right here from this Charles Russell painting from 1909. Last lecture, I couldn't remember the exact date. Where they're basically just, and you've probably seen this in old westerns, riding around town and yelling and hollering and shooting their guns into the air and all that stuff, and creating kind of a general nuisance and sometimes a dangerous situation for pedestrians, uh, particularly kids. So, in a case like that, that's where you have your peace officer trying to maintain the peace, and that's a little bit of a challenge with these basically ramped up cattle hands. And you also had in the mining towns, not quite the same situation. That you didn't have a bunch of cowboys coming in after a long, dusty trail of several months. You had miners who frequently, lived in very rough circumstances. This, by the way, is an actual photograph of deadwood in the Dakota Territory, 1876. The photo might have been from 1877. But whether you're talking about cow towns or mining towns, there were plenty of drinking and gambling establishments. In fact, there were in some of these towns dozens, sometimes as many as 50
By the
or
way, a lot of folks
100
don't realize this
drinking
today,
and
but
gambling
a lot of
establishments, and they
a lot of
maintained a
town
pretty
marshals
brisk
back in that
business.
period
Sort of circumvented the types of problems I was just talking about by having and enforcing very strict gun ordinances within the town limits. In Dodge City, Kansas, which was a cattle town, or Tombstone, Arizona, which was a mining town, uh, when you got to town, you had to check your guns. You had to turn in your handgun at the usually at the marshal's office, and you'd get a ticket, and then on your way out, you could reclaim it. It's almost as though peacekeeping professionals of the time believed that drinking and gambling and guns don't go together. Actually, the fact is, there were several famous Old West law enforcement officers who were killed in the line of duty disarming drunks, which is why some marshals chose to buffalo rowdy drunk cowboys, which is to say, uh, knock them over the head with a barrel of a pistol and knock them out cold, also known as pistol whipping, and then drag them off to jail safely. Now, there were stories that Wyatt Earp had a special long barreled Colt revolver that was given to him, special commissioned for him by Ned Buntline himself. That was had a 10 or 12-inch barrel that he used to buffalo cowboys. There's no actual evidence that Wyatt Earp ever had anything like that, and probably that was added to the Wyatt Earp mythos in the highly fictionalized biography written about him by Stuart Lake in the early 1930s. But it's been associated with Wyatt Earp since, especially in the old 1950s TV show. Of course, sometimes some peace officers had bigger problems in that every once in a while, perhaps they might have to deal with outlaw gangs, maybe robbing one of the town's banks, which is something that did happen. The question is, how often did it happen? And in fact, how often did any of these crimes take place in the Old West? Well, odds are that the crime rate wasn't too much higher at that time than it is in the same place now. Um, it's just that there was a lot of attention paid to it. A lot of these things made the newspapers, but it happened from time to time. While we're on the subject of Old West and lawmen, I want to address something that confuses folks sometimes, and that's the difference between sheriff and marshal, and the difference between marshal and marshal. Um, old um, old Western movies and TV shows, and some newer ones as well, use the terms sheriff and marshal interchangeably as though they're synonyms, as though they are different words for the exact same thing. And that is not the case. There's a big difference between a sheriff and a marshal. Sheriff is an elected office, a county-wide office, um, county jurisdiction, right? So you could be the sheriff of White County or Putnam County. The marshal was not an elected office. Marshal was a hired office, usually hired by the city council, sometimes maybe by the mayor. And their jurisdiction was inside the town limits. In essence, a town marshal was the same thing as a chief of police. So today, there's a big difference between the chief of police and the sheriff, unless you're in a metropolitan area where the city government and county government are the same government, but there are not very many of those. Those are usually really large cities. For the most part, still today, you have a sheriff who's elected and a chief of police who is hired. For example, in the Old West, in Dodge City, you would have had a town marshal, Marshal of Dodge, but you would have also had a county sheriff, the sheriff of Ford County. Bat Masterson was sheriff of Ford County during the 1870s. It gets even more confusing when you bring in the United States Marshals Service to the equation, which there were plenty of people serving in that in the Old West. So United States Marshal, actually the official title of United States Marshal was designated to the person in charge of an entire district, and that was usually a desk job, and then everyone under them was called a Deputy United States Marshal. United States Marshal is a federal position, part of the federal government, and is not elected. Federal marshals, the Federal Marshal Service was established way back at the very beginning of the country after the Constitution was put into place. I think starting in 1791, maybe it was 1793. I think it was 91. Anyhow, the Marshal Service is a very specific service from the very beginning. Today, 21st century, late 20th, 21st century, there's several federal law enforcement agencies, right? There's the FBI, there's the ATF, there's the DEA, and the Marshal's Service is different from any of those in that both in the Old West and today, the Marshal Service is essentially attached to the court system. So, what a federal marshal does is, among other things, transport prisoners from one location to another. That includes people who are on their way to a trial or have been sentenced and are being transferred to a different holding facility. Also, capturing fugitives from the court. That means someone who has been sentenced and has escaped after that. So, what that means is that a federal marshal is the person who would hunt down someone that escapes from prison or that is on bail but has skipped out. A federal marshal is not the person who is going to solve a burglary or a robbery or even a murder that doesn't have anything to do with prisoners or fugitives. They also provide security at courthouses and security for judges. And here's where what I just said does not hold true. They were responsible and still are for enforcing the law on public lands. Now, public lands today in the 21st century all come within the borders of states. There were areas that were unorganized areas back in the time of the Old West, territories, not states. So essentially, a U.S. Marshal or a federal marshal, by the way, today they are sometimes referred to as U.S. Marshals, even if they're not the official chief U.S. Marshal. But people in the U.S. Marshal Service can, their jurisdiction is any area within the United States, basically, and that includes areas that are controlled by the United States, like island territories and stuff like that. So, federal marshal can go just about anywhere except beyond the borders of the country. So, here are some modern U.S. Marshals. Here's the modern Marshal's badge. And here we have kind of a reparsing of what I said earlier, some of the responsibilities of a U.S. Marshal or federal marshal in the 21st century. Now, it gets even more confusing because it was not unheard of in the Old West for someone to be a town marshal and also be a deputy United States Marshal. So a lot of times, if you're a deputy U.S. Marshal out west during that time period, essentially you are not doing a whole lot if there are no prisoners to transport and no fugitives to track down. So, you have an office usually in a sizable town where you are assigned. So a lot of those federal marshals decided to make some extra money by doing double duty since they're already right there in town, and that meant that they were hired on by the town to serve as the town marshal while simultaneously being the U.S. Marshal. Virgil Earp is one prominent Wild West figure who did that. He was the town marshal of Tombstone, Arizona, but at the same time, he was also a deputy United States Marshal assigned to Arizona Territory. Now, for a little bit of an understanding of how the Marshal Service works, you might already be ahead on this one if you have watched the TV series Justified, which is about a member of the U.S. Marshals Service. The character Raylan Givens spends a lot of his time hunting down fugitives and transporting prisoners and also protecting the judge and stuff like that. If you have watched Justified, or even if you haven't, I highly recommend it. I think you'll like it. But when you do watch it, take notice of the fact that Raylan's boss, the chief U.S. Deputy Marshal in Lexington, Kentucky, has on his wall in his office a poster for the movie Tombstone, which of course features Virgil Earp and his brothers. Speaking of TV shows and confusion, for a lot of folks my age or older, the very expression U.S. Marshal summons up an image of this guy, Matt Dillon, character that was portrayed by James Arness on the TV show Gunsmoke, which ran for 20 years from 1955 to 1975, and was in fact the longest running dramatic TV series in history for decades until that record was broken a few years ago by Law and Order SVU. Anyhow, Matt Dillon, Marshal Dillon, is a U.S. Marshal, but he's also the Marshal of Dodge City. And that's where the confusion comes in. People seeing him interacting in various capacities get confused and blend the two jobs together, when in reality, Matt Dillon, the fictional character, was in the same situation as Virgil Earp, the historical figure, which is to say, he was technically, officially, a deputy United States Marshal a member of the U.S. Marshal Service, who was assigned to the court in Hays City, Kansas, and had an office in Dodge City, and was also hired by the town council to be the town marshal or the chief of police. So you'd have to really be paying close attention and watch a lot of episodes, like myself, to notice that when his town marshal job is in jeopardy, or there's any kind of an issue, he has to deal with the city council of Dodge City. But when he picks up his paycheck for his U.S. Marshal Service job, he does it at the post office because it's mailed to him from Washington, D.C., at the War Department, what today we call the Defense Department. So that's why he's right there hanging out in Dodge City. For you younger folks, this is where the expression "get out of Dodge" comes from. If Marshal Dillon tells you it's time to get out of Dodge, it's time to get out of Dodge. Uh, anyhow, so he's hanging around in the town, but also any given week, any given episode, he might be in the desert Southwest somewhere or up in the snowy mountains of Montana pursuing a fugitive. And that's because his jurisdiction as federal marshal is the entire United States. Town marshal, county sheriff, or federal U.S. marshal, no matter which type of peace officer they were in the Old West, they were not likely to get along real well, usually, with outlaws and bank robbers, or with professional gamblers, with what were referred to then as gunmen, bad men, or shootists. The terms gunfighter and gunslinger didn't come along to the 20th century. Didn't even naturally get along well with the cowboys who were driving those herds up into these Kansas towns from Texas. And all that is understandable because it's part of the job. It's an indicator of what their role was compared to the role of those other folks that I mentioned. But even that could be and often was exacerbated by something else, at least in the first half of that Old West period, from the mid to late 1860s through the 1870s. And that other factor was which side were you on in the Civil War? Because bear in mind, let's say it's 1875, kind of the high point of the free range era. 1875. Let's say that you are 30 years old, 1875. Odds are you are a veteran of the Civil War if you are a man of good health of that age. So the farther you go back before 1875, the more likely that is. And then, of course, the more you go past that, after a while, the less likely. But which side were you on? Well, it is not universally true. There were exceptions to this. But by and large, which of those roles that you were playing in these cow towns was also connected to which part of the country or which side in the Civil War you supported and probably fought for. If you were a lawman, if you were the person that enforced law and order, the authority figure and representative of the local or federal government, odds are you were from a Union state. In fact, throughout the first 10, 15 years of this whole process, odds are you were a veteran, a Union veteran. So you can see that list there. Hopefully some of those names are familiar to you, at least a couple of them. Wild Bill Hickok, whom we have already mentioned before in the context of Buffalo Bill's Wild West shows. Wild Bill Hickok from Illinois. was a sharpshooter or sniper in the Union Army during the war. May not have always been veterans, but at least were from states that had, supported the Union. Whereas, those cowboys driving herds up from Texas, being Texans, most of them probably were pro-Confederate. And then also the outlaws, the outlaw gangs, the bank robbers and train robbers, as well as the gamblers and the gunfighters, people who lived sort of a rebellious lifestyle, more likely than not had actually been rebels in the Civil War. Now, like I said, it doesn't always hold true, but most of the time. As time went on, like I mentioned earlier, that became less and less the case as you had people in the West by the 1880s, late 1880s, and particularly into the 1890s and early 1900s. People who were too young to have been in the war, and sometimes not even born during the war, those folks were less likely to hew to these regional traits. So you've got, Billy the Kid. He was originally from New York. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Butch Cassidy was from Utah. I think he was originally from a Mormon family. So that didn't hold true after like that first wave. So it's like Wild West, the second generation. The Civil War was not as big a factor. And you also have to realize that, for hopefully you realize, hopefully you know that Wyatt Earp and Doc Holliday were BFFs, even though they were on opposite sides in the war. Still, pay attention to this. Notice this. And when you're reading about the history of the Old West, or you're watching any of those movies or TV shows, if they are at the least bit culturally accurate. Another area that was described at the time as violent and lawless, although there's a caveat that goes with that, was the Indian nations or Indian territory. Here we have a map of Indian territory and the five civilized tribes as of 1860, right before the Civil War started. As you will recall from lecture number 39, I believe, we talked about how that war unfolded in Indian territory and what it meant for those tribes. Here I want you to take note particularly of the location of Fort Smith, Arkansas. It's right there on the border of Indian territory. And you cross over and you're right there at the place where the Cherokee Nation and Choctaw Nation come together. You might remember that from our Civil War discussion. You'll see why that's important in a moment. This other map is post-Civil War. As you recall, the five civilized tribes had about half that land taken away from them by the U.S. government as punishment for having sided with the Confederacy. And then that western half eventually became Oklahoma territory. All of it, at the end of the Civil War, as a result of those treaties in 1866, was put under the jurisdiction of U.S. district courts. Now, that's jurisdiction so far as anything related to non-Indian people that took place in the Indian nations or in Indian territory, later Oklahoma territory to the west. So what that means is that, the five tribes, they had their own court system, they had their own police, had their own laws. They, at that time, had jurisdiction over their own people or any Indian peoples, but they had no jurisdiction over non-Indian people. So if, let's say, for example, two white guys shoot each other in the Creek Nation, the Creek police force and Creek courts have nothing to do with that. If a white guy shoots a Creek Indian, or vice versa, The Creek Police Force have nothing to do with that either. That's also the jurisdiction of the district court, the federal district court. As you can see here, the area was divided up into three parts. Essentially, the five civilized tribes were under the jurisdiction of the court in Arkansas, the Western District of Arkansas. That court was located in Fort Smith. A good deal of the north and northwestern part of Indian Territory was under the jurisdiction of the Federal District Court in Kansas, which was located in Hays City. And then a part there in the southwestern area of Indian Territory was under the jurisdiction of the Northern District of Texas court system, which I believe that was located in Lubbock. Could have been Abilene, but I'm pretty sure it was one of the two. I know that. By the way, there was an expression that was common at that time. There is no law west of the Mississippi and no God west of Fort Smith, which was not, a testament to atheism, but rather an expression that meant that once you get out west, things are kind of dicey for you. And once you get into the Indian Nations west of Fort Smith, anything could happen, basically. Anyway, the Western District of Arkansas was presided over by Judge Isaac Parker from 1875 until 1896. Parker was, previous to this, he had served a term in Congress from Missouri, came to be known as the hanging judge because he did, in fact, sentence somewhere around 170 people to be hanged over the course of that 21 years. Even had a scaffold set up right outside the courthouse in Fort Smith that could hang 8 people at once if necessary, and sometimes it did. You can actually go there to Fort Smith, and the courthouse and the jail have been restored to their original look and preserved there, and then a replica of that scaffold sits outside. Well, if you were an outlaw operating in the Indian Nations, you did not want to be hauled in before Judge Parker. If you were a Native American and you were accused of a crime, a major crime, such as murder against a white person, you definitely didn't want to be hauled in before this court where you're not being tried by actually your own peers. Believe it or not, there was some prejudice in the area and the time period. Anyhow, Judge Parker became famous, or perhaps infamous, although out of all those death sentences he handed down, a little less than half of them were actually carried out. Some of the sentences were commuted, and some of the people were pardoned, and some of the people died in jail waiting for their sentence to be carried out. But there's Judge Parker, the hanging judge. I said earlier that there was a caveat about the charge of lawlessness and violence in the Indian Nations. And the caveat is this, that even though there was a lot of violence and lawlessness in the Indian Nations, it was not the fault of the 5 civilized tribes. It was due to this very unique jurisdictional situation that developed as a result of those decisions made by the federal government at the end of the Civil War. So think about this for a moment. Okay, now we just outlined this. if you were a gang of bank robbers operating out of Kansas or Texas, and you were being pursued by a posse, and you made it across the border into the Indian nations. If that posse was a local or even state, they could not follow you because their jurisdiction ended at the border. Once you got into the Indian nations, the Cherokee Light Horse or police or the Choctaw or Creek Light Horse had no jurisdiction over you either because you were not Indian. So pretty much nobody has jurisdiction over you except for the U.S. Marshal Service operating out of Fort Smith, or in other words, working for Judge Isaac Parker. So the only people who could go into Indian Territory to try to catch these bandits, whether they were non-Indian bandits and gangs from surrounding states, or if they were, as some existed, some gangs of Native Americans or Afro-Native Americans, or a mixture who had committed crimes against white people. The only people that could touch them were the U.S. Marshal Service, and there was a problem there. Big problem was there were only so many of them, right? And they were frequently heavily outnumbered when they went into Indian Territory, and that's why so many bandits fled to the nations. Because they were in a unique situation there where it was really hard to ferret them out, and the odds were in their favor. In fact, out of all the members of the U.S. Marshal Service who have died in the line of duty since the 1790s, and that's a little over 300, more than a third of them, way over 100, died in Indian Territory between the end of the Civil War and 1907, when Oklahoma became a state. So that 30, 40-year period, a whole lot of federal marshals got killed. And again, that was not the fault of the native people, although it was charged and laid at the door of them. Their neighbors in Texas and Kansas and Arkansas were, look how lawless it is over there. It's terrible that they're allowed to run that place when they can't control anything, and they allow all this violence. Why? What a bunch of savages. We should take their land. So that's very, very inaccurate and unfair. By the way, that situation still exists today on reservations. That's uh, that's the main reason behind the missing and murdered indigenous women situation that maybe you've heard about. It's become talked about more in the media in the last few years, thankfully. The fact that if you are a Native American woman, especially if you live on a reservation, your likelihood of being raped, abducted, and or murdered is much, much higher than women from any other group. And that's because of these jurisdictional issues and the fact that a lot of times uh, men who are inclined toward those kinds of crimes know if they go onto a reservation and commit them, they're more likely to get away with it because still the local authorities on the reservation have no jurisdiction over them, nor do the county or state authorities. The only people that do are federal authorities who are usually occupied with other things. This was demonstrated really well in a movie in 2017 called Wind River, set on the Wind River Cheyenne and Arapaho Reservation up in Wyoming. I believe it's Wyoming. Very well done, and it's a Western, even though it's set in the 21st century. I highly recommend it if you can handle watching that kind of intensity. It really does demonstrate the jurisdictional tangle that exists on reservations and the tragic consequences of it. The Federal Marshal Service in the West has been portrayed in Western films, in movies and television, down through the years. Although usually Westerns, if they're about a lawman, they're about a town marshal or a county sheriff. But there have been quite a few about U.S. Marshals, including the aforementioned Gunsmoke about Matt Dillon, who could pursue fugitives all over the West. There was a Clint Eastwood movie, one of his early westerns, Hang 'em High, in which, although the names were changed clearly, his boss is supposed to be Judge Isaac Parker, and he's operating out of the Fort Smith court going into the Indian Nations. And both versions of True Grit, both the John Wayne version and the Jeff Bridges version, Rooster Cogburn, U.S. Deputy U.S. Marshal, operating out of the court of Judge Parker and going into, in this particular movie, or these two versions of the same story, the Choctaw Nation to pursue outlaws and bad guys in general. Here are three of the real life federal marshals or deputy U.S. marshals who operated out of Hanging Judge Parker's court in Fort Smith, Arkansas, and were active in the Indian Nations in the Old West. Each of these three, Bill Tillman, Heck Thomas, and Bass Reeves, each of them we're going to talk about in a little bit of detail in just a little bit. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, there were white outlaw gangs that operated in the nations, such as the Dalton Gang. Here they are at the end of a very bad day in 1892. Two of those four individuals there are two of the four Dalton brothers. One of the other ones was arrested on that very bad day. Four Dalton brothers, actually there were five Dalton brothers. The oldest Dalton brother was a U.S. deputy marshal who was killed in the line of duty. And then all the other Dalton brothers had also worked as federal marshals out of Judge Parker's court. And after their older brother was killed, and they sort of sat down and did the math about what a small amount of money they were risking their lives for, they decided that might be more lucrative to be on the other side. So they crossed over and became bank robbers and were pretty successful at it up to a point. We'll be talking a lot more about the Dalton Gang and the Dalton Doolin Gang later, probably within the next lecture or two, but I'm going to be talking about outlaws and outlaw gangs. And as I mentioned, there were also outlaws from the nations. Right here, we have four examples, four individuals that usually are listed among the Cherokee outlaws, particularly if you read especially more dated books about the Old West or about outlaws and gunfighters. Although I would argue, and I'm pretty sure that most Cherokees, contemporary Cherokees, would agree, that only two of these individuals qualify as outlaws in the traditional sense, whereas two of them are Cherokee national heroes. So the two that qualify in the traditional sense, so far as robbing people and stuff, were Henry Starr and Cherokee Bill. And we will talk about them later when we're talking specifically about Old West outlaws. So right now we're going to talk about the other two, and the other two being Zeke Proctor and Ned Christie. And we're going to start with Ezekiel or Zeke Proctor, who was born in northern Georgia before Indian removal. He, during the, here's a picture of him, by the way, later in life. During the Civil War, Zeke Proctor served in the Indian Home Guard, that is the Union group of Native Americans from the five civilized tribes, as a scout, and he was a member of the Kitua Nighthawk Society, that is that group of pro-union, generally anti-slavery, and very strongly traditionalist Cherokees who were in favor of protecting traditional Cherokee culture and heritage and sovereignty, and against becoming too much like white people, essentially. So, that's setting up Zeke Proctor. He was known to be a pretty amiable and friendly, and it seems likable guy for the most part. But he was also known to be a heavy drinker and to have something of a temper. He was known to go to his favorite saloon in Cincinnati, Arkansas, across the border, and get a little bit loaded and trash the place. And then, he always came back the next day and dutifully paid for the damages. However, a situation arose in which Zeke Proctor, the Kitua Nighthawk ex-Union guy, was upset about a situation going on with a woman named Polly Beck. She was a member of the Beck family there in the Cherokee Nation, which is a pretty large family, most of whom, by the way, had served in the Confederate Cherokee services throughout the war. It's a little unclear about what the relationship was between Zeke Proctor and Polly Beck. Some say that he was in love with her and was spurned. Some say it was just general principle that motivated him to go to the mill that Polly Beck had inherited from her husband in February of 1872. Now, Polly Beck's husband, Stephen Hildebrand, a Cherokee, had owned this mill. By the way, this photograph is not of the original mill, but the one that was built to replace it around 1900. He owned this mill. He died, and she hired a white guy, Jim Kesterton, to help around the place. And at one point, Kesterton was married to Polly's sister. At another point, he had been married to Zeke Proctor's sister. Eventually, he gets married to Polly Beck, or maybe they didn't actually get married, but certainly they were a couple. I'm not entirely sure if they got married or not. Anyhow, now he's running the mill. And Zeke Proctor was upset. What was he upset about? Well, he was generally opposed to, as a lot of traditionalist Cherokees were, to white guys showing up in the Cherokee Nation and intermarrying and then controlling Cherokee lands and Cherokee property. So that's the general principle part. There are various other stories. One is the story that I mentioned, that Zeke Proctor had been a suitor of Polly Beck. Another story says that Kesterton had abandoned Proctor's sister, and maybe Polly Beck's sister also, and their children in order to go and take up with Polly Beck, leaving his previous families with no means of support, and that upset Zeke Proctor. Regardless of what the reasons were, he showed up at the mill, and he had been drinking, and he was mad, and he was intent on shooting this white guy, which he attempted to do. opened fire on him. Some stories say that Kesterton had a minor wound to the head, maybe a crease. Others that he got out of it with just a couple of holes in his coat, but he did manage to escape from Zeke Proctor because of Polly. Um, Polly threw herself in front of Kesterton, and she took one of Zeke Proctor's bullets to the chest, which killed her. Now, depending on which side you were on, some people say Zeke Proctor went there with the intent of killing both of them, killing the couple. Most other people believed Zeke's story, which was went there to kill the white guy, and regretted the fact that the Cherokee woman got in the way, and that his shooting of her was an accident. Either way, Kesterton flees out of the Cherokee Nation, and Zeke, the next day, turned himself in to the Cherokee sheriff. Well, this is 1872. At this point, the kinks hadn't been entirely ironed out about that jurisdictional stuff I was talking about a few minutes ago. Now, it was clear that a white person committing a crime in the Cherokee Nation was not subject to Cherokee laws, but that rather he was subject to the Western District Court of Arkansas. It was not agreed upon, though, between the Cherokees and the U.S. government what would happen if a Cherokee tried to kill a white guy and it didn't work. So there was no murder there. Cherokees believed that they had jurisdiction over the Cherokee, and the U.S. court believed that they did. And in fact, Jim Kesterton and Polly Beck's relatives, a whole bunch of Becks, led by White Sut Beck, went out to Fort Smith, lobbying, in fact, for the U.S. court system to come in because they believed that Zeke Proctor would not be successfully prosecuted by the Cherokees for his killing of Polly Beck because Zeke Proctor, well, he was very popular. He was also related to a lot of the people that were in charge. And at this time, most of the people in charge were the formerly pro-Union Cherokees. In fact, the Cherokee principal chief, Lewis Downing, who had taken over, had been elected after John Ross had passed away, Lewis Downing was related to Zeke Proctor and also had been a lieutenant colonel in the Union Cherokee forces during the Civil War. So he had been Zeke's commanding officer. So the Beck family believed that there's no way that a trial would be fair, and so they wanted him to be taken to Fort Smith and tried there. Now, by the way, all this happened in the Going Snake district, which was one of the 9 districts set up by the Cherokees in the Cherokee Nation as of that time. So you can see where that's located. Well, Cherokee government refused to turn Zeke Proctor over to be tried by hanging Judge Parker in Fort Smith, and determined to have the trial right there. Although it was a little hard finding a judge that Zeke wasn't related to, they finally found a judge, a Black Hawk Six killer, and they decided not to have the trial in the regular meeting place of the district court there in the Going Snake district because they were a little bit fearful that something was going to happen because the Beck family, which was quite large, and their friends and supporters, who tended to be formerly pro-Confederate, had a vested interest in getting revenge on Zeke Proctor. So the court was moved to a different building. It was moved to a log schoolhouse. Now, this is not the actual log schoolhouse, but it looked very much probably like this one. It was built with logs. It only had one door, and it only had a couple of windows on one wall. So it was easier to defend if attacked. And turns out that was a good idea because a posse from Fort Smith, led by a couple of U.S. Deputy United States Marshals, arrived at the courthouse while court was in session. So there's a bunch of people in the courthouse, and there's an even bigger bunch of people standing around outside the courthouse to see what was going to happen, some of whom were Becks or Beck supporters, and there were several Becks, I think 4 or 5 of them, in the, I think it was a 18, 19 person posse coming in from Fort Smith. So the deputy marshals ordered their posse to stand outside the courthouse while they went in to demand custody of the prisoner. But some of the posse members, the Becks, rushed into the courthouse and started shooting. And there was a general melee, a huge shootout going on inside this log schoolhouse, in which the judge was wounded by buckshot. One of the jurors was wounded. The defense attorney was killed. And White Sut Beck had a double-barreled shotgun, and he was about to shoot Zeke Proctor when Proctor's brother, Johnson Proctor, I think his name was, jumped in front of the prisoner and grabbed the shotgun, trying to wrestle it away from Sut Beck, who discharged one barrel into Proctor's brother, who still held on as long as he could, giving Proctor time to get to cover behind a chimney, behind a rock chimney. And Proctor was able to get a hold of a pistol, and he's returning fire from behind the chimney. And people are getting shot inside. Meanwhile, people are getting shot outside as the crowd, which was kind of divided, as well as the posse members still outside. They're all shooting at each other. What eventually happened was that 8 members of this posse were killed, including one of the federal marshals. 8 of them were killed, and about 10 of the others were wounded. So the casualty rate in this posse was like 95%. And inside the courthouse, of course, the defense lawyer was dead. Zeke Proctor's brother was dead. A bystander who was pro-Proctor was dead. Several other people were injured. Proctor himself had gotten a couple of buckshot pellets to the foot from that shotgun blast that had been intended to kill him. The wounded surviving members of the posse quickly limped away and left the Cherokee Nation back to Fort Smith. It was decided to, it was time to tend to the wounded. It was decided next day to finish that trial before another posse got there. So they changed locations again, had the trial, and Zeke Proctor was acquitted. It was ruled that his shooting of Polly Beck was an accident. So, at this point, Proctor is freed. He and several of his supporters, perhaps as many as 50 of them, went up into the hills. Now, Proctor had been a scout during the Civil War and afterward. He knew the woods really well and knew those hills that this is the area in eastern Oklahoma where things are kind of rugged and hilly as opposed to farther west in the state where it becomes just like flat prairie. Um, there was no immediate response of posse members because at this point it was known that Proctor had a small army and was up in the hills, and it was going to take a whole lot to dislodge him. Now, by the way, at this point I want to mention that day in April when the trial was held at the Going Snake Courthouse, which was actually a schoolhouse, that was the largest loss of life suffered in a single day by the United States Marshal Service until 9/11. Well, how was this responded to by people in general? It depends on which people you're talking about. Most Cherokees supported Zeke Proctor and believed that the resistance to that posse was an act of Cherokee nationalism to try to preserve and protect Cherokee sovereignty. Unless you were on the side of the Becks, in which case you thought he was a dirty, low-down murderer. And what about the people who were not Cherokee that lived near the Cherokee Nation or just really the rest of the country? Well, here's just a couple of newspaper reports. You can see that Proctor is being presented as the most vicious, bloodthirsty outlaw in the country, and that's kind of what stuck really throughout the country in how Proctor was portrayed in history books when he was for the next 100 years or so. The arguments about what to do about this went all the way to the halls of Congress and to the White House because the Cherokee Nation still refused to hand over Zeke Proctor, which the U.S. courts were still insisting on. And Principal Chief Downing sent Cherokee delegates to lobby in Washington to try to iron out the details of just exactly what their rights are. And the way this ended was that the President of the United States, Ulysses S. Grant, pardoned Zeke Proctor and his supporters, whereupon Principal Chief Downing pardoned the Becks, who were also being charged with murder by the Cherokees. And so a truce was introduced. No pun intended, didn't mean for that to rhyme. But after that, Proctor was a free man. And it can be said, and it has been said, that Zeke Proctor was the only individual in American history with whom the United States government made a treaty. Now, after this, 1877, Proctor was elected to the Cherokee Senate. And then, in the 1890s, for several years, a good part of the decade of the 1890s, he served as a Deputy United States Marshal operating out of the court in Fort Smith under the supervision of hanging judge Isaac Parker. So 20 years after this incident, he's working for the court. He also got elected district sheriff there in the Cherokee Nation. So he lived to the age of 76. He died the year Oklahoma became a state in 1907. And like I said, he is regarded as a nationalist hero still today by many Cherokees. Next, we're going to look at Ned Christie, also a citizen of the Cherokee Nation from the next generation after Zeke Proctor. Ned Christie was born in Going Snake District in the 1850s. Unlike Zeke Proctor, who had been born in the traditional Cherokee homeland in the east, and had wound up as a child being in Indian Territory as a result of the Trail of Tears. In Christie's case, it was his parents who had been on the Trail of Tears, and he was born afterwards. Christie's father had served in the Union Army, in the Indian Home Guard, in the same the same organization there as Zeke Proctor, and his father had been also a member of the Kituwa Society, which was still around, and Christie was also a member. So we're talking about events now that started in 1887, at which time Ned Christie was living with his wife and 13-year-old son, working as a blacksmith and a gunsmith. And 2 years previous, he had been elected to the Cherokee Senate, was very highly respected and well regarded to the extent that he was on the executive board of the Senate, was one of 3 people on that board who were the principal advisors to the Cherokee principal chief. So very highly regarded, a statesman as well as a working man. Now he did occasionally, like Zeke Proctor, have a drink on this night in May of 1887, May 3rd. He was drinking with friends, and by the way, at this time, manufacturing and selling alcohol was illegal. It was against the federal law in Indian Territory. So that's another thing that U.S. Marshals were doing, specifically in Indian Territory, was they were going around and looking for stills and arresting moonshiners and bootleggers. Anyway, there was a marshal, a U.S. deputy marshal named Dan Maples, who was on the hunt for moonshiners and bootleggers in Indian Territory. And one of the chief suspects was a white guy named Bud Trainer. So Maples and a posse man were in Indian Territory, riding along one night when someone fired on them from ambush and shot Marshal Maples and killed him. Didn't die immediately. He lingered on for a little bit, but they were not able to identify the person who fired the shot. However, they suspected it was Bud Trainer, so the marshal started rounding up Trainer's known associates and questioning them. And one of those associates said, "Oh, no, it was that Cherokee, Ned Christie." So that put him on the radar, if there was such a thing as radar at that time, of the Marshal Service. Now, Christie was already on the radar of the federal government because he was a leading voice in opposition to the Dawes Act. Remember us talking about that a few lectures back. This was around the time that was making its way through Congress. As a member of the Kituwa Society, he was very much a traditionalist. He was also very much a nationalist who was looking to protect Cherokee sovereignty. Well, now he's wanted for murder, and he's expected to turn himself in to be taken to the court of Judge Isaac Parker, the hanging judge in Fort Smith, Arkansas. He did not believe he would get a fair hearing, nor did any of his friends. However, he wrote a letter to Judge Parker agreeing to surrender if there was a guarantee that he could post bail so that he could look for evidence to prove his innocence. But he received no reply to that. So he did not turn himself in to the hanging judge. Instead, much like Zeke Proctor, about 15 years before him, he sort of fortified himself and refused to come in, and the marshals were going to have to come get him. Now, by this time, the Ex parte Crow Dog case had taken place, which we also talked about a few lectures ago, that resulted in the Major Crimes Act, which meant that as of 1885, even one native person killing another native person was still a federal thing. So definitely federal authorities have officially jurisdiction according to the U.S. government. Well, refusing to come in, eventually he discovered that he had been indicted by a grand jury in Fort Smith in absentia. So now it's to the point that he needs to come in, or he is expected by the government to come in to stand trial for murder. Again, he didn't do that. So the Marshals Service sent several marshals out to try to catch him. By this time, it's 1889. And the leader of the group of federal marshals they sent was Heck Thomas, who would be one of the most famous U.S. deputy marshals in the this period of the late 1880s and the 1890s. Thomas was originally from Georgia. He was a Southerner. When he was a teenager, he had served briefly in the Confederate Army. Now, after these events in 1889 and 90, he's going to move on to teaming up with the other federal marshals, Bill Tillman and Chris Madsen, to become the Oklahoma, the three guardsmen of Oklahoma, as they were called, and is going to be spending most of his time trying to catch the Dalton gang, and then later the Doolin gang. But initially, he's in charge of trying to bring in Ned Christie. Christie, like I said, is not coming in. He has armed himself and fortified himself. At one point, well, actually, there were several occasions. There were several scrapes where posses came into the Cherokee Nation and tried to catch him, tried to find him, sometimes got a glimpse of him, sometimes had exchanges of shots and little skirmishes. On one occasion, this was under the command of Thomas. He had not moved on to chasing the Daltons yet. Group of marshals burned down Ned Christie's house, and he himself was wounded while escaping. Later on, more marshals are sent in. There was another incident where his blacksmith shop was set on fire, and that spread to, I think, his new house, and that all burned down, and he got terribly injured again in that one, along with his nephew, Little Arch Wolf. However, he continued to resist, and there were still several people that were willing to stand with him in this resistance. Finally, 1892, around the time that Thomas was now out of the picture because he's dealing with the Daltons, which we'll talk about probably next time, or maybe the time after that. But it's a different marshal, Marshal Yo, who is leading the posse members against Ned Christie. There's another skirmish in 1892 in which Christie repels those marshals who are trying to get him. By this time, Christie and his companions had built not just a regular house, they'd built a fort. Essentially, it was double walled, double log walls. So there's a wall, and then there's another wall inside of that, and in between the two walls, they filled it with sand, which will stop any kind of bullets that anyone had that they were trying to fire into the house. They had very few windows. They had slots from which to look and from which to stick out their rifles and fire on anyone attacking them. The Marshal Service, the posse went up to Kansas and borrowed a cannon from the Army. So they brought the cannon, and they were going to try to blast open the walls with the cannon. By this time, it's November of 1892. And knowing that this was some pretty heavy walls here, they double loaded the cannon right? They want a really huge shot, and it blew the cannon up when they fired it. So no cannon. Instead, some of them were able to make their way up to the wall of the fortress, the mini fortress, with a bunch of dynamite, and they set off the dynamite and blew open the wall there, and the place was set on fire. The cabin was surrounded with no way out. Ned Christie with much like Nate Champion that we talked about, which was going on around the same time, with his guns in his hand, ran out the door, guns blazing, and went down in a hail of bullets. Now, the posse took a door from the building and tied Christie's corpse to the door to transport it. They were taking it back to Fort Smith. They stopped in Fayetteville and showed off this dead body. They were offering to let people take photographs with it. It was displayed again on the streets in Fort Smith. One of those photographs was turned into a postcard celebrating the death of the infamous Cherokee outlaw Ned Christie, who actually, was not an outlaw in the sense that, of Jesse James. He had not robbed anybody. He had been accused with no real evidence of murder, and it was really hearsay. But he had been played up in the papers now for 3 years, much like Zeke Proctor, at this point 20 years earlier, as this desperate outlaw, this desperado, this violent and cruel person. And that also is what stuck with the American public and wound up showing up in the history books, much like Zeke Proctor. These two guys being presented as Cherokee outlaws. However, like I said, they were both essentially, being members of the Kituah Society, they were Cherokee nationalists and traditionalists, and they were regarded as heroes. So Zeke Proctor at this time was a deputy United States Marshal, but he wasn't involved in the hunt for Ned Christie. By the way, in 1918, more than a quarter of a century after the death of Ned Christie, an elderly black man gave an interview to a newspaper in Oklahoma in which he revealed that he had witnessed the murder of Deputy U.S. Marshal Dan Maples in 1887, that he had seen the whole thing, and it was in fact Bud Traynor. But the guy had been afraid to say anything until after Bud Traynor died because of fear of reprisal, him being in kind of a vulnerable position as a freedman or black man in the territory there. So it is now known as a fact that Ned Christie was in fact innocent the whole time. There is a commemoration of Ned Christie on a plaque on the courthouse in Tahlequah, which is still the Cherokee capital, identifying him as a national hero, a hero who was, according to the plaque, assassinated by the United States government. This was a time, the 1890s, when the Cherokee people were in need, really, of heroes to look up to, especially if they're heroes of resistance, even if, like Ned Christie, they are martyred heroes, or like Zeke Proctor, they are redeemed heroes, because that Dawes Act, which Christie had opposed, of course, it passed. By the early 1890s, it's starting to be enacted. However, initially, the Dawes Act did not apply to the 5 civilized tribes, nor did it apply to the Iroquois up in New York, because purpose of the Dawes Act is to quote unquote civilize the Indians, and these are the Indians that are already civilized, at least in the eyes of the American public. However, there were plenty of U.S. citizens who had come, sweeping in to Oklahoma Territory, and in those land booms, who were looking longingly over at that really good land that the Cherokees and the Creeks and the Choctaws had, and the others, and were complaining about the violence and the banditry and outlawry that was going on in the Indian nations, and pointing to that as evidence that these Indians are savages, and it's totally unfair that they have control of all this good land, which could be productively used by good white American citizens. So, in 1898, there was an amendment passed to the Dawes Act called the Curtis Act, which was officially called an Act for the Protection of the People of Indian Territory, protecting the people from all the violence going on, which really was made possible by the federal government policies. Anyhow, what this really meant was now the Dawes Act is going to apply to the 5 tribes, and those tribal governments are going to be dissolved, and the individual tribal members are going to be given an opportunity to claim a lot. Not a lot, but a lot for allotment, right? A land plot under the Dawes Act. Well, most Cherokees didn't want to do this. Some were fine with it. Some of the businessmen among the Cherokees and Creeks and Choctaws and Chickasaws and so forth supported the Curtis Act because they saw an opportunity for increased population and for increased profit. However, for the most part, the tribes resisted, although they did not resist militarily. They resisted in the courts. And one thing that they did when this continued progressing, and by the way, I can go into a lot more detail about this, and I do in my Cherokee history course. But by 1905, the tribal governments of the 5 tribes came together and proposed having their own state. So, okay, if you're going to bring in Oklahoma Territory as a state, because there was talk about that after this allotment business over in the western part of the state, then they wanted to have their own state as one of the states of the U.S. that they proposed calling the state of Sequoia, but Congress did not go for that. It didn't come through. The tribal governments were dissolved, and in 1907, Oklahoma became a state. And like I said, if you were Cherokee, particularly, this would be a very discouraging and depressing time. So people like Zeke Proctor, who, like I mentioned earlier, died the year that statehood for Oklahoma came, and like Ned Christie, resistors to the essentially the imposition upon Cherokees of control and loss of their sovereignty. So all this tied up in ways that have become obvious as we've had this discussion with the U.S. Marshal Service, and like I said earlier, it really, in many ways, still is. If you find these stories compelling, which they are, there have been a couple of really good novels covering this material, including Zeke and Ned by Larry McMurtry and Diana Osana. Larry McMurtry, of course, Pulitzer Prize-winning author of Lonesome Dove, and Ned Christie's War by Robert Conley, who is or was Cherokee of the United Keetoowah Band of Cherokees. Taught for many years at Western Carolina University in North Carolina. And those are both fictionalized accounts, novels. I also wrote a short story called Ned Christie's Fort that has appeared various places. Really good academic, scholarly history work about Ned Christie came out a few years ago by the Choctaw scholar Devin Maheshua, which I highly recommend. It really Maheshwa, she came up with a lot of details that had previously not been really discovered, and brings an indigenous perspective to telling the story. All right, well, that is the conclusion of our little part here about lawless, quote unquote, places that required strong actions by peace officers, or at least the perception was that that was required. It really was required in those cattle towns and mining towns. But the situation in the Indian nations, as I indicated, was a lot more nuanced and complicated than the situation in just trying to control a bunch of drunks in Abilene or whatever. So next, we will look at some of the famous lawmen of the period.